Jessie Childress, who's a master's candidate in public history in the history department. The title of her talk today is Maintaining Insanity, Fire Protection, and the Costs of Running the South Carolina State Hospital in the 20th Century. Jessie.
Okay, hello. So, as the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane continued to grow and change into the 20th century, its needs also expanded and transformed. The thousands of patients housed in treatment buildings were sustained by many auxiliary and maintenance structures behind the Babcock Building to the east. Mills Drive, or Doom Street as we've nicknamed it, is a small utility street lined with functional buildings which were key components to the asylum's daily workings. To alleviate the difficulties of maintaining such a large dependent population, increasing costs of maintenance, and protecting against fire in old buildings, the hospital's administration realized the value of increasing self-sufficiency. The laundry, ice plant, bakery, and mechanic shop helped the institution become independent from the city by providing necessary maintenance on site. By the 20th century, the Bull Street campus essentially functioned as a small independent city complete with its own fire department. The fire department was likely constructed sometime between 1926 and 1938. As the central building in the cluster on Doom Street, it is flush with the repair shop. Its southern elevation faces the street and features a standing seam metal front gable roof. This one-story rectangular frame building is covered with corrugated metal siding, is a bluish-gray color, and sits on a brick and concrete foundation. The facade has two large side-hinged wooden doors clad in metal siding, which cover the entire width of the building. The hinges are fastened into the wooden timber frame. The gable, which is covered in corrugated metal, features a centered white wooden louvered attic vent. Before becoming the sleeping quarters, a sweet potato shed sat on the site, built between 1910 and 1919. The southern end of the sleeping quarters also faces the street, and it is also a rectangular wooden frame building with a standing seam metal front gable roof. It is covered in white painted horizontal wooden siding and has no windows on the facade. The facade has a single wooden door featuring a boarded up window and a blinded opening in the gable. The building has a poured concrete slab foundation and a crawl space with an earthen floor. The maintenance structures, especially the fire station and sleeping quarters, tell an important narrative about the inner workings and perceived needs of public custodial care in the 20th century. Although small and lacking in high-style architecture, these buildings were purpose-built for a specific public goal, much like the grander asylums they supported. During the asylum movement of the early 19th century, many public mental institutions across the nation were constructed to house both paying patients and state-funded inmates. Although built with state funds, the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane's founders expected the asylum to be maintained by patient fees. In the asylum's early years, paid admissions did outnumber paupers, as desired, but the unpaid population continued to rise. As lower-class inmates were less likely to be discharged to welcoming families, they began to accumulate in the hospital wards. The Kirkbride Plan, which became the standard asylum plan across the country, had a unique layout that allowed for additional wards and was specifically designed to accommodate increasing inmate populations. As early as 1853, the Board of Regents at the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum determined the existing facility was inadequate to the growing population, and they called for the Kirkbride Place Babcock Building to alleviate this overcrowding. Despite hospitals' efforts, sorry, my Excel skills are not the best, patient populations nationwide continued to exceed building and staff capacities. From 1903 to 1950, the number of patients in state hospitals increased from 150,000 to 490,000, resulting in overcrowded facilities and a shift to custodial rather than curative care. By 1918, the South Carolina State Hospital housed an astonishing 2,077 patients. In 1932, this number jumped to 3,378, upwards of 400 more than it should have held. This put quite a strain not only on the medical care available to patients, but also on the hospital's maintenance staff and budget. The rising costs of food and supplies continually increased the per capita daily expenditure. Despite the end of World War I, which was expected to bring down the cost of living and prices, maintenance costs increased by about 30%. The Great Depression brought spending down by about a third, and by 1933, the cost of supplies caused considerable alarm to the Board of Regents. They stressed that they could not continue to admit patients unless the hospital was given additional buildings and equipment. By the 1940s, no asylum in the nation met the minimum staffing and budget standards set by the American Psychiatric Association. World War II meant continued hardships and shortages for the hospital as the WPA money, which had funded limited building projects during the Depression, was diverted to defense programs. The war years were marked by an inability to secure enough materials and workers. Food and clothing were difficult to procure and had to be purchased where they were available. In 1941, most of the mechanical personnel left for higher wages at Fort Jackson. 2 years later, more employees joined the armed forces or worked for the military for higher pay. At war's end, nearly every man employed by the hospital had been drafted into the armed forces. As in the First World War, peace did not improve the personnel or supply shortages. Supplies were limited until 1948, and the personnel situation never quite rebounded. During World War II, conscientious objectors assigned to mental hospital work saw firsthand the overcrowding at asylums across the nation. These outside observers contacted journalists who published exposés of asylum conditions, such as Bedlam 1946. In this Life magazine piece, Alfred Q. Maisel reported, "We jam-pack men, women, and sometimes even children into 100-year-old fire traps in wards so crowded that the floors cannot be seen between the rickety cots, while thousands more sleep on ticks, on blankets, or on the bare floors. Institutions that would be seriously unmanned, even if not overcrowded, find themselves swamped with 30%, 50%, and even 100% more patients than they were built to hold." These tell-all media pieces contributed to public disapproval of the mental hospital and the eventual decline of the institution. Even into the 1960s, the hospital remained horribly understaffed, especially in nursing, since it lacked the funds required to hire people and to match other states' medical salaries. The hospital's patient population soared to over 6,500, leaving each nurse with 120 charges. Maintenance staff did eventually recover, and by 1972, the hospital had 2,000 employees. The services division performed practically all the functions of a small city, supported 8,000 members of Columbia, and was a tremendous industrial operation. Maintenance staff included plumbers, electricians, painters, welders, carpenters, farmers, garbage men, a blacksmith, a printer, a greenhouse manager, clerks, ice makers, bus drivers, and machine operators. A modern mechanical bookkeeping and payroll system brought in a new business manager. Except for a brief experiment with commercial laundry services in the 1950s, all laundry was also done in-house. Of the $2.25 daily per capita costs in 1950, $1.40 financed personal services, which included maintenance, laundry, and power. 38 cents went to food, and 47 cents covered supplies and clothing. While the state hospital functioned as a relatively self-sufficient community in its later years, its overcrowding and shortage of medical staff would doom it as a health institution. Aside from the economic and medical crises caused by the hospital's overcrowding, a much more dangerous side effect plagued the campus. Too many patients and beds in each building blocked exits, causing a potentially severe disaster in the case of fire. This fear was realized early on May 29, 1918, when a devastating fire broke out on the campus and killed 17 white male inmates. 45 sleeping patients were awakened by the nurse in charge of the ward, who discovered the fire. The one-story frame structure attached to one of the main buildings with several hundred patients was quickly destroyed. Although unidentified, it may have been this building, the East Pavilion of the Mills building, which disappears from the Sanborn maps between 1910 and 1919. The Kiowa Courier described the building as very old, an easy prey to the flames, and a veritable fire trap. While the cause of the fire was not discovered, the likely cause was defective wiring, and the superintendent felt as though it was an accident. All of the patients were evacuated, but most of them ran back into the building. 15 burned to death inside, 1 was rescued twice, but later died of his injuries, 2 were deemed not likely to survive, and 2 received minor burns. Dr. C. Fred Williams, the superintendent, issued a statement to the Courier that the dead are so charred that they cannot be identified. However, all those who lost their lives are known, but they cannot be differentiated. He later said in the 1918 annual report that had the inmates of the burned building been normal, there would have been no loss of life. The character of the building, the time at which the fire occurred, and the mental condition of the inmates were contributing causes to the extent of the disaster. By the time the city fire department arrived at the asylum, the fire had spread so quickly that there was no chance of saving the building. Other asylums across the world also suffered from lethal fires in the early 1900s. A February 1903 fire at the Colney Hatch Asylum in London resulted in the deaths of 52 women. Most of the hospital's inmates escaped the wards, but the fire destroyed the campus and nothing was left standing. The Marlborough Democrat described the event as wild with excitement and so panic-stricken that not only were they unable to help themselves, but greatly impeded the operations of those trying to save them. Some patients were burned in their beds, and the charred remains of others were found huddled together in corners, while groups of partially consumed bodies on the side of the corridors showed that many persons lost their lives and sacrificed those of others in their frantic efforts to force a passage through the main building. The August 1911 fire at the asylum in Hamilton, Ontario, was caused by a short circuit on an electrical wire. It spread onto the violently insane floor, where many patients fought against the rescuers. According to Orangeburg's The Time and Democrat, the asylum brigade, although fighting bravely, was handicapped by the maniacs and was losing control, and the firemen fighting both the flames and the insane were in constant peril. At least 8 patients died in this catastrophe. In addition to the always present danger of fire, an overcrowded ward of mental patients created an extra obstacle for firefighters in securing life and property. To fight this unfortunate circumstance of large old buildings, the South Carolina State Hospital made many efforts to prevent the outbreak of fire from the asylum's beginnings. Completed in 1827 and constructed of brick and stone, the Mills Building, in typical Robert Mills fashion, was designed to be fire resistant. Before the fire department was professionalized in 1903, the fire brigade was all volunteer, with 7 paid drivers constantly on duty and 15 horses kept at the engine houses. The state hospital had 1 hand engine. Every night, bathtubs in each ward were filled with water, and water pails and chemical extinguishers were distributed throughout Babcock. In 1909, note was made in the annual reports that they always paid special attention to the improvement of fire protection. That same year, following an inspection, Chief W.J. May of the Columbia Fire Department reported to Dr. Babcock that the hospital had an excellent fire protection system which would become first class with the upgrading of hoses. Fire escapes and fire walls were added to the main building in 1914 for a cost of $5,000, and by 1915, patients and nurses were regularly performing fire drills. Despite the efforts of the asylum to prevent fire, such a large institution with a significant dependency population was particularly at risk and needed its own firefighting force. By June 1919, the asylum had an organized fire company of 32 men under the command of Chief E.M. Dickert, 1 hose reel, 1 chemical on wheels, 1 hook and ladder truck, and 51 chemical extinguishers. Discussions of forming this fire company date back to 1915, when the annual report stated, "It is planned to have a fire company formed by the employees detailed from the various departments for that purpose, who will be trained in first aid and methods of dealing with fires." In 1918, the fire station and apparatus had been completed. At this point, the State Hospital Fire Department was one of 4 stations serving the entire city of Columbia. In 1927, the hospital's fire department gained a semi-permanent place in the annual reports, in which Chief Archie Marsh and the Columbia Fire Department are constantly praised. The State Hospital Department made regular inspections of the hospital grounds, often with Chief Marsh. The equipment by this point included 2 hand reels and hose, a motor truck, and a chemical engine. The newspapers praised Dickert's department for its speed and efficiency of fire drills, often clearing entire buildings in 2 minutes without patient confusion. In 1938, the hospital still had its own well-equipped fire department stationed at the asylum, although still under close watch of Marsh. Chief Dickert left in 1914 and was replaced by Chief Jessie Childress. Although the fire department section disappears from the annual reports in 1950, The fire station and sleeping quarters appear on the 1956 Sanborn fire insurance map. At least into the 1960s, the hospital had 2 fire trucks and 3 ambulances, and nurses and attendants still regularly directed fire drills for the patients. The buildings on Mills Drive, east of Babcock, known in 1956 as the fire station and sleeping quarters, remain standing. At some point before their abandonment, they were renamed the ground sheds and the lock shop. The fire department, as with most other buildings on Mills Drive, has suffered significant water damage and shows signs of rusting. The metal roof and siding are coming loose, and the white paint on the attic vent and rafters has also flaked. The metal doors appear to be loose on their hinges and must be kept closed with a concrete block. The paint on the sleeping quarters is in poor condition, and the roof is also rusted from water damage. Some pieces of wood siding have peeled away from the frame, most notably a large piece along the bottom edge of the eastern elevation. However, the building looks to be in sturdy condition and on a solid foundation, so its lack of integrity is largely cosmetic. While these buildings' association with firefighting on the campus is less than obvious, the landscape around Mills Drive is scattered with a spectrum of firefighting apparatus. Many of the buildings have fire alarms and hose reels attached to their exterior walls. Older on-off switches, which controlled water supply to the nozzles on the buildings, are all over the area and are mixed with more modern fire hydrants dating from about the 1950s. These water supply systems and alarms were praised by contemporary newspapers for their good condition, proper place and order, and general unusual attention to detail. These small details, as recognizable cues of firefighting, contribute to the asylum's history of fire prevention. As a whole, these 2 buildings and their associated hardware tell an important, if somewhat overlooked, narrative of asylum life in the 20th century. As with the other maintenance buildings on the site, they were built as rising inmate populations and costs necessitated. With the failure of the curative care medical system, the mental hospital became a custodial institution. These thousands of patients did not care for themselves, and as their care was much more than simply medical, the narrative of maintaining insanity should not be forgotten.